All right, hello everyone. Just to introduce myself really quickly, I'm Larson. I'm the Senior Director for Product Management at Uniken. Oops. There we go. Sorry, wrong slide was up. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about borderline edge cases for FIDO. Looking at why they're necessary, why they're hard, and also provide some background on some options for approaching these in your organizations. I wrote this abstract after attending a Madonna concert, so just, fair warning ahead of time, but I felt like this was very apropos. You've been here for a couple days, you're now excited about passwordless, there's a lot of different things you can do with FIDO. You're gonna go back, hopefully try all these things out in your organizations, and you're gonna run into these problems that are gonna stretch your love of this protocol in ways that maybe you won't believe. So, the goal of this is to give you some background, give you some frameworks that you can help take back and approach these problems holistically, and hopefully bring all those edge cases back from that borderline implementation for you. Okay, so to start off with, some use cases with FIDO are hard. They are. But let's talk a little bit about why that is. So to start with, this is just directly from the WebAuthn abstract, all right? Just copy and paste it verbatim. So what this says is this specification defines an API enabling the creation and use of strong, attested, scoped, public key-based credentials by web applications for the purpose of strongly authenticating users. Well, it's a lot of verbiage to squeeze into one sentence, a lot of different concepts there. But the thing that I want you to really think about here is that emphasis on web applications, okay? Similarly, if we look at the CTEP specification, which is kind of the other half of the FIDO authentication standards, this says this protocol is intended to be used in scenarios where a user interacts with a relying party, typically a website or native app, on some platform like a PC, which prompts the user to interact with a roaming authenticator like a smartphone, okay? So, if you're looking at both of those verbiage, WebAuthn and FIDO authentication and passkeys were developed with that web application in mind, right? Now, when you go back to your companies, there are a lot of issues with this. Not everything is a nice web interface. Not everything is a modernized application. And so part of where people get hung up and what I've seen customers have issues with is where they get into these kind of squishy places, right? FIDO is great, and if you're truly committed to eradicating passwords from your infrastructure, that means doing it everywhere. And some of that stuff does not fit into either of these specifications so far. So we're going to look at that. So let's just dive in, because this is where all the fun stuff happens. So the first thing that we're going to look at is implementations for IoT and OT. So IoT, I think everybody hopefully is aware of, is Internet of Things. These are usually network-connected devices. Typically, they're used to send and record information. It could be something like temperature checks for refrigerator systems. You could be looking at something like security cameras. There's a lot of different things now, light bulbs, Ring cameras, you name it, it's all connected on the web. Okay? The other thing to be aware of is something called OT, or operational technology. This is typically hardware and software combinations that were designed to control manufacturing systems, mechanical systems, and often these were implemented without any thought that they'd ever be connected to a larger web, right? So I used to work in a manufacturing plant. I got to do some process control language coding back in the day, which was super hairy and fun. But all of that was designed to be on a closed networked system, right? So what's happened is as these things have developed, there's more connectivity, there's more places for people to get in. That also means there's more places to authenticate and more things to authenticate as well. And this can be one of those areas where FIDO gets a little tricky. So let's talk about why you'd want to look at FIDO for these systems, because there's already some things in place to be able to secure these. So why would you even want to consider this to begin with? A lot of this has to do with people interfacing with these systems. IoT, it's only good if you're getting that data back or you're able to send signals out to those IoT devices. You probably want to control how those are being interpreted and who's sending them. So that can be one area. It could be an administrator who is administrating that network of systems, either for IoT or in the case of operational technology, it may be in the case of an operator. So, think of somebody that's working on your manufacturing line that needs to change things like line speed, like how fast equipment's running. These also represent kind of a critical attack point. So, in the case of OT, you have a lot of control if you get into these operational technology systems. So things like utilities, you can wreak a lot of havoc if you get into there. For manufacturing, it's very similar. You can totally shut down a manufacturing plant if you want. So they do present like a very critical attack plane. The other problem with this is like securing with some of the traditional kinds of technologies doesn't always work well. So a lot of these systems, since they're designed to be offline, since they're designed to be kind of with that security control around the network, they're not really set up to do things like federation. They may not be set up to do things like certificate authentication with something like PKI. So it presents a little bit of a headache for people that are trying to control these systems. The other part of these is that they're usually very limited in terms of interface. So unlike a rich web client like you would have if you're logging into a PC, often they're talking like command line controls in the case of IoT, or in the case of OT, you're typically interfacing through some specialized input monitor. Like I said, federation may not be an option, and there are implementation blockers at both the software and the hardware layer. So if you are trying to authenticate with something that is, say, like NFC enabled, you may or may not have that as a piece of an option on like the admin interface or on the operator interface for these systems. So with all that said, not to make you feel bad, but we'll talk a little bit about how we can look at this. So IoT and OT are typically set up in some kind of hub and spoke style implementation. For IoT, this is usually done through a protocol called MQTT or MQ telemetry transport. And then for OT, typically you are talking about some kind of interface that is then controlling all those systems that are connected to it. There used to be a piece of software called Wonderware that was very popular for doing this kind of back in the day when I was working with it. There's some newer, more advanced interfaces for that, but typically you're talking about some kind of controller that the operator is going to go over, push physical buttons on to make things happen. So the big thing with this is to really think about what it is that you want to secure with FIDO. What I have seen sometimes is where people go a little overboard and they kind of want to do like FIDO everywhere. So when they're looking at that hub and spoke model, that includes doing system-to-system communication with FIDO. And sometimes that can work, and sometimes that doesn't. There's no actual user that's involved in that transaction. So really think about that. If you're looking at things like just removing the password from your attack plane and you're wanting to secure your administrators, you're wanting to secure your operators, then focus on that. And that means that you're looking at securing access into that controller, you're securing access into that communication hub in the case of IoT, and you're looking at it on the person level. So then what you can do is extrapolate that out and to say, okay, now I know what my use case is, I know what my scenario is, and then you can start looking at the process of how do you communicate with that interface. In the case of IoT, it can be a little bit easier because often you're going over, you're remoting in to these controllers, so you can use some processes that way. For OT, that can be a little harder because typically you are communicating through some kind of fixed interface hub. And that's where doing things like extending that to include an NFC reader could be helpful, or looking at other mechanisms of being able to get those FIDO credentials where they need to be on the controller. The other option here that I find really interesting that's kind of emerging is an option called FIDO device onboarding, or FDO. This is a process really for the devices themselves, not so much the administrators, but if you are looking to secure the nodes in your network, that could be a really good option for you. What that provides is some FIDO certificates that are onboarded during manufacturing time to the device. So when you get that certificate, get the device, it's preloaded with the certificate and it's ready to go. So really think about that. I've had a few people that I've talked to and worked with where they go full sail, all in on FIDO right away, and then they get overwhelmed. So make sure that you're picking those use cases that are appropriate for these types of things, so that you're chunking it out in a way that makes sense for you. Okay, so next use case that I have seen people have problems with is fat or thick clients and legacy applications. So the clients, these are typically desktop apps. Usually they're pretty heavy applications, often an interface to something like an ERP system or a business process system of that sort. And then there's also a lot of legacy applications out there. The hard part with both of these is that typically they were designed before anybody thought that you'd be able to log in ever without a password. So often the way the screens are set up, the way the requirements are set up for the back-end system are completely tied to having that user ID and password. And they can be a very challenging place for people who are trying to adopt passwordless and trying to roll out FIDO for that reason. Typically, these are also places where people are logging into a lot. So if you think about the context of a ERP system where maybe you have supply chain, maybe you have accounting systems, you're gonna have your workforce logging into those repeatedly every day. And they are also business critical applications. It's not something that you can go to your CFO and say, yeah, we're trying to do this cool thing as security, and we need you to get off that ERP system because it just doesn't work with what we're trying to do. You can try that. I don't know that you're going to be successful, but if you are, please let me know. I'd love to hear about it. So that means on the security side that we have to figure out how to work with these types of systems. And since these are critical and you are dealing with a lot of business functionality in them, they are someplace that you really want to make sure that you are securing and are including in your FIDO implementation. So that's kind of the issue. So, one of the obvious solutions here is to try to see if you can federate. Is there an option to take that legacy system, that ERP FAT client, and federate it with a IAM system that supports those modern types of auth, either directly through the application, or maybe you can use SSO so that you're not having to do that login to the system every time. Sometimes this is possible, sometimes it's not. So, but it's definitely, I think, the first option with a scenario like this. The other thing that I want to put out here is just because you are going FIDO doesn't mean you have to go passwordless everywhere. So if you are looking for security, if you are trying to get that stronger authentication, often I've found with some of these systems, they have additional extensions that you can hook into. Usually those were designed to work with like a OTP or RSA tokens, that type of functionality. But what that does give you is a hook in the login process that then you can implement another authentication, stronger authentication method with. So I would consider U2F in this case, which is universal second factor. What that will allow you to do is to use one of the FIDO protocols to secure your authentications to that system. So that's definitely worth a look. Since a lot of these systems were built in that era, kind of post user ID passwordless only, but sort of pre-passwordless, I guess, those hooks are often there. So make use of those. The other alternative, if you can support it, if it's truly just like a UI issue and not a system application issue, is to look at implementing something like the cross-device sign-in flow for FIDO. So if you're able to support that with the UI, what that'll allow you to do is to use your, basically your phone or a security key as an authenticator. But you can take that authentication process out of that legacy FAT client application and host that someplace else, and then be able to log into your app. So it can be like a nice workaround for those situations where you have, this kind of hard-coded user ID password mentality. So make sure you're thinking about that as well. Okay, the last use case I wanted to get into, which I think sometimes is the absolute most difficult for people, is kiosk. And what do I mean by kiosk? What I'm talking about here is a shared workstation. So this is usually a single device. It will be used by multiple people during the course of the day. This could be in something like a call center. It could be in something like a warehouse situation where you have a PC that's dedicated to looking up location of inventory or other information. There's a lot of different places where this style of setup happens. There's usually some nuances to this. Some kiosks are set up to log into the device level itself. Other kiosks are set up so that you can log into a proxy application. But either way, there's some kind of login that the person that's walking up to that kiosk needs to do. One of the hard parts with the kiosk use case is that security is actually very key here. You'll have multiple people with multiple types of roles logging into these kiosks throughout the course of their day. So somebody may be a supervisor and they're logging in to update scheduling. Somebody else may be logging in just because they need to know where to go get something in the warehouse. You may have somebody else that can log in and update inventory, but there's a lot of different scenarios here that need to be addressed and covered. The other hard part with this is that you need an easy way of doing authentication. Just having worked in these environments, if you're not providing something simple, then people are gonna default to that Post-it note that's below their keyboard, and everybody all of a sudden is logging in as the same person. Okay, so let's talk about this. One of the key things here is to determine what it is that you actually need to log into. Do you actually need that device layer, or can you log into the application layer? Because this will change how you approach authentication on that device. You also want to see how you can keep that authenticator moving with the person throughout their day. So one of the hard parts with FIDO is, since it is bound to something, either a passkey provider, security key, your phone, whatever that mechanism is, if you have somebody that's logging into 5 different systems during the course of their workflow, that authenticator needs to move with them. And it's got to work everywhere where they're working. So the other problem we've seen is where sometimes people will solve a problem with one type of kiosk, but then they forget that there's a mainframe or something like that people have to use someplace else. So keep in that mind. Just as a note here, sometimes you can federate all this, and that's awesome, but the authenticator problem is still an issue they're going to have to think about and address. And I am almost out of time, so we're going to end there and see if there's any quick questions.
I can just ask.
Oh, no.
Have a question, Shane? Okay, so the question here says, while it's still phishable, what's your position on combining the OAuth device code flow with the FIDO-enabled OAuth authorization server? I actually think that's a really good solution in a lot of ways. There's some really cool combining that you can do between strong authentication with FIDO and then coupling that with OAuth for authorization layer access. So I would think that would be a great option. Okay, and I think that's time. Thank you. Appreciate your attention through Whirlwind. Really difficult to use cases. There's more here than this. I'm happy to have any discussions with you if you have specific questions. I couldn't get into all the details here, of course, but have had to do this with a variety of different applications. So I have some ideas if you need them. So thank you.